The smell of burnt sugar and sawdust hangs heavy over the Arkansas Fairgrounds. But Ella Mae can only taste the copper of blood in her mouth. Under the blinding glare of the stadium floodlights, her brother Bo stands on the main stage, his face projected 40 feet high, radiating the golden smile of a savior. Below the stage, hidden in the shifting shadows of the scaffolding, two men in charcoal suits are closing in, their hands moving toward the holsters beneath their jackets. Ella Mae's fingers tremble as she fumbles with a jagged, rusted data drive, her eyes darting between the security team and the massive digital screen that looms over the cheering crowd. The heavy iron gates of the arena have already been locked from the outside. Every exit is a wall of muscle, and the local deputy just turned his back, ignoring her frantic signals. As the music swells and the town prepares to crown its favorite son, Ella Mae realizes she isn't just an uninvited guest at a celebration. She's a ghost being hunted in her own backyard. She has exactly 60 seconds to reach the technical booth before she disappears into the dark woods forever. And the only thing louder than the roaring crowd is the rhythmic, metallic click of a handgun being readied just a few feet behind her. The rusty hood of the old Chevrolet shuddered under a sudden, racking cough from the engine as Ella Mae Jenkins crossed the county line. The windshield, a road map of hairline fractures and spiderweb cracks, vibrated against the onslaught of a parched wind carrying the scent of pine resin and grit. Ella Mae's fingers gripped the cracked steering wheel rim with such ferocity that her knuckles paled, matching the sickly hue of the faded vinyl seats. 10 years ago, she had fled this place in the back of a stranger's truck, a ghost escaping a funeral. Now, she returned to the rhythmic rattling of a loosened suspension system that threatened to surrender with every mile. The road sign announcing the town limits bore the jagged scars of old bullet holes, its paint peeled away in thick, sun-baked flakes to reveal gray metal beneath, looking like a fresh scar on the face of an ancient enemy. The gas station greeted Ella Mae with a sharp, chemical stench of cheap fuel and a gaudy excess of plastic pennants strung up for the impending fair. Everywhere she turned, posters plastered with grinning faces stared back. Yet the actual gaze of the locals, men in grease-stained caps fueling their heavy-duty 4x4s, remained cold and needle-sharp. The laughter of children chasing after clouds of pink cotton candy struck Ella Mae as unnaturally loud, a jagged sound against the backdrop of a pervasive, simmering tension. Men paused their conversations, leaning against the pumps to track the progress of her dented pickup with predatory stillness. The heavy, humid air of festive anticipation pressed against her chest like a physical weight, and the rhythmic thrum of the fuel pump echoed the ticking of a countdown clock. Every movement from the pedestrians felt choreographed, a rehearsed hostility that made the simple act of driving down Main Street feel like a march toward a gallows. Ella Mae reached for the zipper of her battered leather bag, the dry snap of the metal teeth cutting through the stifling silence of the truck's cab. Inside lay yellowed forms and folders stamped with official seals, exhaling the scent of damp basements and decaying paper. She traced the pads of her fingers over Bo Jenkins's signature, a sprawling, arrogant script scrawled across fraudulent invoices. These sheets represented the irrefutable trail of how Bo had bled the family legacy dry, transmuting communal timber into private offshore accounts. The thick paper felt sharp, nearly slicing her skin as it reminded her of every stolen board and every laborer cast out into the dirt. Ella Mae zipped the bag shut, pulling it tight against her ribs like a loaded revolver primed for a single, devastating shot. The pickup lurched to a halt before the gates of the family sawmill, a place where the air had once hummed with the fragrance of fresh sawdust and the vitality of honest work. Now, a suffocating silence hung over the sagging roofs of the old hangars. The main mill's spine had buckled under the weight of years and deliberate neglect. Rusty teeth of circular saws protruded from the weeds like the headstones of a forgotten cemetery, the sawgrass growing taller than a man's waist. Only a few yards away, behind a new fence of spiked wrought iron, loomed Bo Jenkins' shimmering corporate office, all panoramic glass and a pristine helipad. Ella Mae watched the sunlight dance off the fresh lacquer of expensive imports parked in the executive lot, while the walls of her father's enterprise succumbed to black mold and creeping fissures. The violent contrast between the ruins and the riches forced her to bite her lip until the metallic tang of blood filled her mouth. Ella Mae glided along the gray perimeter of the warehouse, her boots picking a silent path through dry brush and shards of broken glass. Inside the mill, the shadows grew thick and cool, saturated with the smell of old grease and ancient dust. She froze behind a stack of rotting planks, a single bead of cold sweat tracing a line down her spine. Her heart hammered in synchronicity with the distant, mechanical drone of equipment operating on the far side of the property, where the new money lived. Peering through the gaps in the weathered wooden wall, she monitored the empty access road, waiting for the arrival of a familiar silhouette. Her muscles coiled tight, her breathing reduced to a shallow, rhythmic hush, while the gloom of the old workshop swallowed her whole, shielding her from the prying eyes of the town. The silence shattered under the shrill scream of tires as a motorcade of black SUVs rolled toward the corporate office. Bo Jenkins stepped out of the lead vehicle, adjusting the collar of a bespoke suit that looked entirely alien in this rugged timber country. A ring of thick-necked men in matching charcoal shirts, radios clipped to their belts, immediately closed ranks around him. Bo flashed a wide, practiced grin, tossing a hand up toward invisible voters, his voice carrying over the lot with the effortless authority of a king. Ella Mae watched as he clapped en garde on the shoulder with a proprietary air, signaling to anyone watching that this dirt, this air, and these people belonged to him alone. The gold watch on his wrist caught the high noon sun, flashing a blinding, defiant spark into the shadows where she hid. Ella Mae stepped out of the darkness, the soles of her boots letting out a sharp, rhythmic crunch against the concrete floor. Bo froze, his politician's smile sliding away to reveal a cold, predatory sneer. Ella Mae hoisted the bag and began shouting her accusations, her words striking like physical blows as she detailed every embezzled cent and every calculated betrayal. She gestured toward the skeletal remains of the workshops, pitting their decay against the sterile glass of his new empire. Her voice vibrated with a raw, jagged fury when she branded him a thief who had cannibalized their father's life work to feed his own political hunger. Bo stood motionless, his eyes narrowing into two dark, obsidian slits, while his retinue took a heavy, synchronized step toward her. Bo Jenkins threw his head back and let out a short, barking laugh that echoed off the hollow walls like a gunshot. He wiped a mock tear from his eye, regarding Ella Mae with a frigid disdain reserved for a persistent insect. He declared that she was a relic of a dead past, her words nothing more than the delusions of a failure who couldn't find a place in the world. Bo took a predatory step toward her, closing the distance until the smell of his expensive cologne clashed with the scent of her desperation. He demanded she vanish from the county before the sun touched the horizon, his voice stripped of its jovial veneer and replaced by the steel of a man who didn't recognize the word no. He turned his back with theatrical finality, signaling to his men that the nuisance was to be dealt with. Ella Mae lunged forward, snatching a bundle of documents from her bag to thrust them toward Bo's face. He intercepted her wrist mid-air, his fingers clamping down on her skin like iron shackles. Bo leaned in until his breath chilled her cheek, whispering that accidents were a common occurrence on dilapidated sawmills, and that no soul would bother searching for a body in the deep, suffocating reaches of the Arkansas woods. Ella Mae felt a needle of ice drive into her spine as he tightened his grip, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. In that moment, She understood that the blood they shared meant absolutely nothing to him. He was no longer a brother, but a monster protecting its horde. With a sharp, dismissive nod from Beau, two guards fanned out, flanking the only exit between the towering stacks of timber. The heavy wrought iron gates behind her groaned shut with a final, metallic thud, severing her path to the pickup. Ella Mae spun around, seeing two more of Beau's shadows taking up positions by the fire exit, their arms crossed over their chests in a silent, immovable wall. The world around her began to shrink, the territory of the sawmill transforming into a concrete cage designed for her disappearance. She heard the distinct, synchronized click of locks engaging on the SUVs, and she realized the trap had fully closed. Beau stood in the center of the ring, watching her frantic gaze with the cold satisfaction of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. In the distance, the rhythmic pulse of red and blue lights flickered against the trees as a patrol car approached, and Ella Mae threw her hand up in a desperate, frantic wave. The cruiser slowed at the gate, but the deputy behind the wheel merely exchanged a brief, knowing nod with Beau Jenkins. Ella Mae watched the officer adjust his rearview mirror and turn away with total indifference, his tires kicking up a cloud of dust as he accelerated back toward the main road. The grit from the patrol car's tires settled on her clothes, a physical reminder of her absolute isolation. She understood then that the sheriff's badge and the very concept of law in this county had been bought and paid for by Beau years ago. Her hope for official intervention crumbled into ash as the siren's wail faded into the forest, leaving her alone with her executioners. Ella Mae clutched the bag to her chest, feeling a cold, calculating resolve ignite within her. She realized that a courtroom would never touch Beau Jenkins, but his political trajectory relied on the fragile glass floor of public adoration. She caught the eye of one of the guards, seeing the hesitation there, and she knew her only path forward was to shatter the image he had spent a decade perfecting. Ella Mae vaulted over a rusted chain and burst into the long, low-slung barracks, where the air tasted of sour sweat and stale tobacco. Old Frank, the man who had taught her to sharpen a saw blade when she was barely tall enough to reach the bench, dropped his tin mug. The murky coffee spread across the greasy table like an ink blot. Ella Mae reached for the old man's shoulder, but Frank recoiled as if she carried a plague, his hand slapping the heavy bolt of his door into place. The dry, percussive thud of latches and the metallic snap of locks rippled down the hallway, turning the residential block into a blind wall of gray timber. Through the thin plywood partitions, she heard only the heavy, terrified breathing of men who hid their faces, terrified of losing their only scrap of bread to a ghost from the past. From the loudspeakers mounted on poles along Main Street, Beau Jenkins's voice drifted out, a smooth, velvet purr filled with manufactured concern. Ella Mae froze, listening to him narrate a family tragedy to a local radio host with a sickening, practiced tremor in his tone. He lamented the poor little sister whose mind had been hollowed out by the gutter fever of big city dens. Pedestrians slowed their pace, shaking their heads in collective pity as Beau described the hallucinations and violent outbursts that allegedly plagued her. Every word he spoke laid a thick layer of toxic fog over the town, transforming Ella Mae's identity into the portrait of a deranged criminal before she could even say a word in her defense. She watched mothers pull their children closer, their eyes widening with fear the moment her silhouette appeared at the end of the block. Ella Mae sprinted to the edge of the gravel lot and stopped dead, staring at the shredded ribbons of rubber hanging from the rims of her pickup. A jagged blade had carved deep, weeping wounds into the sidewalls of all four tires, the last of the air hissing out into the humid afternoon. Shards of the headlights crunched under her boots like fine diamond dust as she circled the dead vehicle. On the windshield, scrawled in thick, oily black marker over the existing cracks, were the words, "Leave while you can." She touched the sticky lettering, the scent of rubbing alcohol and cheap paint stinging her nose. The truck looked like a slaughtered animal, displayed for the town to see as a warning. Wind whistled through the shattered glass of the cab, carrying scraps of her old road maps into the roadside ditch. Twilight began to pool in the narrow alleyway between the butcher shop and the pharmacy, when two shadows detached themselves from the brickwork. Ella Mae felt a violent yank at her shoulder, the tough fabric of her jacket groaning under the attacker's grip. A man in a dark ski mask pinned her throat with his forearm, while a second reached for the leather strap of the bag she held against her side. Ella Mae picked her way through a thicket of stinging nettles toward the abandoned trailer, its aluminum siding coated in a slick, greenish film of mold. The door hung by a single, tortured hinge, creaking with every gust of wind, while the interior exhaled a stench of rodent droppings and rotted upholstery. She dropped to her knees, frantically shoving aside shards of broken glass and piles of damp, ancient newspapers to reach the loose floorboard she had memorized. Her fingers clawed at the dark void where the steel box of documents should have been. The hiding spot gaped back at her, empty and mocking, while the dust around the perimeter bore the fresh, heavy tread marks of combat boots left only hours before. Amidst the shredded foam of a ruined cushion, Ella Mae spotted a jagged scrap of glossy paper wedged into a floor crack. It was a fragment of an old photograph, her father smiling in front of the mill's first major lumber shipment. But his face had been obliterated by a crude, black cross. On the reverse side, scrawled over the watermark in the expensive ink of Beau's fountain pen, were words that made her blood run cold. "The show must end in a triumph, Ella Mae. I've saved you a front row seat." A jagged, icy fury constricted her throat as she crushed the paper in her fist, the sharp edges of the photo stock biting into her palm until white lines marked her skin. Ella Mae dove into the kaleidoscopic crowd at the base of the Ferris wheel, where the air was a thick soup of hot grease and burnt sugar. The rhythmic thrum of a diesel generator muffled the sound of footsteps. But suddenly, two of Beau's security detail, broad-shouldered men in clinical gray polos, materialized from behind a shooting gallery. They didn't run. They moved with the fluid, synchronized grace of hunters, methodically flanking her to cut off the path to the parking lot. One man pressed a finger to his ear, murmuring into a sleeve mic, while the other locked his gaze onto her, never blinking. The gaps between the colorful kiosks seemed to shrink, and Ella Mae felt the trap of human bodies beginning to tighten around her. She ducked under the heavy canvas flap of a tent filled with arcade cabinets, where the air vibrated with electronic chirps and tinny, synthesized loops. Dozens of screens erupted in neon pinks and toxic greens, bathing her face in a flickering, artificial glow. The guards hesitated at the entrance, momentarily blinded by the strobe effect and the frantic movement of pixelated characters. Ella Mae crouched low, crawling past a row of humming slot machines whose mechanical levers clacked in time with the frantic thudding of her heart. In this chaos of neon glare and grinding gears, the silhouettes of her pursuers looked like clumsy, oversized shadows, losing the scent in a labyrinth of plastic and glowing wire. Heavy palms slammed onto Ella Mae's shoulders just as she tried to slip behind the curtain of a traveling circus display. The pungent odor of sawdust and caged animals hit her, and the two guards slammed her against the wooden side of a trailer with bone-jarring force. The sliding door of a black van nearby hissed open, revealing a dark, cavernous cargo hold. One of the men sneered, pulling a set of heavy plastic zip ties from his pocket, and leaned in to whisper that the dirt beneath the old pines was deep enough to hold the entire Jenkins bloodline. Ella Mae felt her boots lose contact with the ground as they began to hoist her toward the black mouth of the vehicle. Ella Mae exhaled a sharp, jagged breath and twisted her body, swinging her heavy brass belt buckle in a short, lethal arc against the lead guard's temple. The man cried out, his grip on her jacket failing as he recoiled, and his partner stumbled on the soft, churned-up earth of the fairgrounds. She bolted toward a nearby stall where a machine was vomiting a massive, sticky cloud of steam from a cotton candy vat. The white, sugary mist billowed around her, a sweet shroud that masked her movements from the dazed pursuers, whose curses were drowned out by the roar of the crowd. She ran through the saccharine fog, the cloying taste of sugar on her lips and cold sweat stinging her eyes. She burst out into the open expanse of the central square, where a sea of people in flannel and denim surged under the white-hot glare of the floodlights. 1,000 voices rose in a synchronized roar, chanting Bo Jenkins' name with a fervor that sounded like rolling thunder against her eardrums. Laborers from the sawmill, men whose faces she had known since childhood, were now thrusting their fists into the air, blinded by the golden promises of a man who had stolen their futures. Flags bearing Bo's corporate insignia snapped in the wind, and the air was so thick with fanatical adoration that Ella Mae felt herself becoming invisible, a ghost drowned in an ocean of someone else's manufactured will. Bo Jenkins stood on the high dais, his silhouette carved out by the spotlights until he looked like a titan towering over the valley. He adjusted the thin wire of his headset, his triumphant grin projected onto the massive LED screens flanking the stage, turning his face into a godlike mask of success. Ella Mae looked up at the glowing red digits of the digital clock above the grandstand. Less than 5 minutes remained before the live broadcast hit the statewide networks. Bo took a slow, theatrical sip from a crystal water glass, his eyes roaming over his subjects with the absolute certainty of a man who believed his sister had already been erased. She clutched the final piece of evidence in her pocket, feeling the seconds bleed away like water through a sieve. Ella Mae hooked her fingers into the freezing rungs of the iron ladder leading up the side of the technical tower and began a frantic ascent. The rusted metal bit into her palms, leaving deep, stinging gouges and the metallic scent of blood. But she didn't falter. The wind at this height turned vicious, whipping her hair across her face and trying to pry her off the steel ribs of the structure. With every rung, the roar of the crowd below grew distant, replaced by the lonely whistle of the air moving through the girders. She hauled herself onto the final platform, her arm muscles trembling with exhaustion, while far below, the tiny beams of flashlights marked the guards still hunting for her in the dark. The door to the control booth flew open, and a young technician in oversized headphones didn't even have time to turn his chair before Ella Mae's elbow connected with his jaw. The boy slumped to the floor, and she lunged for the heavy steel door, slamming it shut and throwing her entire weight against the handle. Her eyes landed on a massive metal equipment trunk. She dragged it across the floor with a guttural groan, wedging it firmly against the door frame. Outside, the heavy thud of boots and the muffled shouts of Bo's security detail began to rattle the hinges, but the barrier of steel and heavy gear held firm. She turned to the glowing console, where 100 flickering lights and sliding faders controlled the very voice of the town. Her fingers shook with a fine, electric tremor as she jammed the battered flash drive into the main server's port, and the loading icon began a slow, rhythmic pulse of blue light. Behind her, the shriek of a power tool or an axe began to chew through the door. Bo's men were hacking their way in, and shards of gray plastic sprayed through the gaps. Ella Mae frantically toggled switches, overriding the outgoing signal while confirmation windows bloomed across the monitors. The sound of the assault on the door became a deafening, rhythmic boom, the vibrations traveling through the floor and into her very bones. The last byte of data regarding Bo Jenkins's embezzlement flowed into the system, a digital fuse ready to ignite. Ella Mae froze, her index finger hovering over the crimson Enter key, looking through the reinforced glass of the booth at the stage below. Bo Jenkins squared his shoulders and leaned into the microphone, beginning his rehearsed oration on honor, family values, and the unbreakable traditions of their forefathers. His voice, amplified by the massive speaker arrays, vibrated through the technical booth, filling the small room with the very lies she was about to incinerate. She watched him press a hand to his heart in a practiced gesture of sincerity, and in that moment, she slammed her finger down. The screens on the square flickered to black for a heartbeat, only to erupt a second later with the truth. On the gargantuan screens of the Fairgrounds, the polished campaign reel of Bo Jenkins's family values was violently replaced by the clinical, dead-white glare of spreadsheets. Instead of the candidate's winning smile, the retinas of the stunned crowd were seared by columns of incriminating figures, offshore tax stamps, and high-resolution scans of bank transfers bearing Bo's unmistakable signature. The roar of the crowd died so abruptly, it felt as though the town's collective throat had been cut. The only sound remaining was the low-frequency hum of the transformers and the dry wind skittering empty paper cups across the asphalt. Photos of hidden accounts, showing the six-figure sums drained directly from the sawmill's pension fund, pulsed across the monitors, bathing the pale, upturned faces of the workers in a cold, electric light. Bo Jenkins spun toward the screens in a state of naked shock, his tanned, healthy complexion turning the color of wet ash under the merciless floodlights. The camera, locked into a high-definition live stream, captured every agonizing detail of his collapse. The frantic twitch of his eyelid, the beads of sweat soaking through his silk collar, and his mouth hanging open in a silent, pathetic gasp. This mask of pure terror was broadcast to the entire county, transforming the town's hero into a cornered thief in real time. He gripped the edges of the podium so hard the wood groaned, his polished shoes squeaking uselessly against the floorboards as he tried to find his footing. His manufactured majesty fell away like cheap paint, revealing the hollow, frightened creature beneath. A heavy security boot shattered the upper hinge of the control booth door, and the steel panels slammed onto the concrete with a thunderous crash, kicked aside in a cloud of acrid dust. Ella Mae, without even glancing at the men rushing in, punched in the final sequence of symbols and snapped the plastic head off the activation key. The control console erupted in a steady, crimson lockout signal, rendering the hardware a useless hunk of metal to anyone trying to kill the feed. The guards froze, staring at the flickering monitor where the progress bar had been replaced by a permanent, unbreakable wall of code. Ella Mae felt the heat radiating from the servers and the sharp scent of ozone, watching as the truth continued to burn Bo Jenkins's reputation to the ground in a relentless, unblockable stream. A completely unhinged Bo Jenkins charged into the booth, shoving his own men aside with the desperate strength of a cornered animal. His breathing was a ragged, wet rattle. He lunged at Ella Mae, the force of his shoulder check sending her sprawling across the floor into a tangle of severed cables. She hit the ground hard, the sharp edges of the metal equipment racks biting into her back. Bo dropped onto her, his fingers clawing at her collar, his spit hitting her face as he screamed for her to kill the transmission. His eyes were bloodshot, his face a mask of primal rage, and his hands, the hands that had signed away the town's future, now tightened around her throat.